Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Rosh Hashana Daf Hey is entirely discussing a brisa which we have begun on Daf Dalid, analyzing the halacha of Baal Ta'acher. The halacha of Baal Ta'acher is that if you have an obligation to bring a carbon or something else that you have to give, you have a minimum time in which you're allowed to do it, and if you leave it for too long, you violate the Isser of Baal Ta'acher. Do not delay. As the Torah has said, Kisidar neder l'Hashem Elokecha lo yisa'acher l'shalmoi ki darosh yidrishenu me'imach Hashem Elokecha me'imach v'haya b'cha chet. If you have something which you owe, a neder, something that you promised, don't delay it, because if you do delay it, Hashem will demand it from you and you'll end up with a sin. So the Gemara has given, we have quoted a brisa that had 5 opinions as to how long you have until you violate the Isser of Baal Ta'acher. The Gemara is in the middle of analyzing those 5 sources, how they learn from the Psukim, and then the Gemara is going to go through the different halachos, the different phrases mentioned in the Mishnah, and the Gemara will try to give a source for each of them. So first of all, we've been discussing the pasuk B'chag HaMatzos, B'chag HaShavuos, B'chag HaSukkos, where we link all those 3 Yom Tovim. According to some of the Tanaim of the Mishnah, that was the source of the halacha of Baal Ta'acher applying to all 3 of them. The Gemara is trying to find what the other Tanaim do with it. The Gemara has already said that you learn from Pesach to Shavuos, you learn that there is tashlumin for the Karban Chagiga. If you didn't bring the Karban Chagiga on Shavuos, you could bring it up to 7 days afterwards, because you learn that halacha from Pesach. If you didn't bring it on the first day of Pesach, you could bring it within the 7 days of Pesach itself. So the Gemara wants to know, why do you need Sukkos? That explains why you need Shavuos and Matzah and Chag HaMatzos. Why do you need Sukkos to be stated here? So the Gemara answers, you need that for a different halacha. According to these Tanaim, you need it to tell me the halacha of Lina. The halacha is that on Sukkos, it says clearly you have to spend the night, because it says, you should only go home in the morning. So Chayesala comes to the Beis HaMikdash to be Ola Regal, should stay the night after Yom Tov, should stay the first night of Chol Hamoed, and only in the morning of Chol Hamoed should they go home. You learn that from Sukkos to Pesach. That's all you have, all 3 stated together, Chag HaMatzos, Chag HaShavuos, Chag HaSukkos. So the Gemara says, now according to the other Tanaim though, who don't use this pasuk for this, they use it for Baal Ta'acher. How do they know the halacha that you could bring your carbon chagiga on the days after Shavuos, including Shavuos? That's the 7-day period from Shavuos until the 7 days, including Shavuos, and the 6 days afterwards. So how do they know that you're allowed to bring a carbon chagiga for Shavuos that entire time? What's their source? They don't have this source. So it says they learn out of a different source, as Rabbi Bar Shmuel said, because the Torah says as follows. It says that you count the days and you get to Rosh Chodesh, which is Chodesh, and you count time and you get to Shavuos, which is Chodesh. Where do you count the days and you get to Chodesh? So in discussing the Slav, it says not a day, not a week, up to 30 days, ad chodesh yamim. It says up to a month worth of days. So you count up all the days, the Torah says, ad. And then you get to chodesh, you get to Rosh Chodesh. And Shavuos, we know, we count Svira until we get to Shavuos. So therefore there's a comparison between Rosh Chodesh and Shavuos. Just like Rosh Chodesh is one of the days that you're counting, it's one of the days of the month. Shavuos is also like one of the days, is like one of the weeks that you're counting. You're counting weeks to get to Shavuos. So Shavuos is also one of the weeks. Now, what that teaches me is that you have a week after Shavuos, you have a week in which to bring the carbon, that kedusha, that's referring to the carbon. There's a carbon Rosh Chodesh and a carbon Shavuos. You have a week to bring that carbon. Just like you have 30 days, and then Rosh Chodesh is the day in which you bring the carbon. You count 7 weeks, and then Shavuos you have a week to bring the carbon. That's how the limud works, comparing Chodesh to Shavuos, and therefore you have it like that. So the Gemara then asks, but you don't count in weeks leading up to Shavuos, you count the days. Sefiras number is 49 days. Maybe you only have 1 day. You have 1 day of Shavuos to bring the carbon of Shavuos. Who says you have weeks? So Gemara says, well, we know that the halacha is you're supposed to count days and weeks. Somebody just counts the days. If he says on day 14, he says today is 14 days, and he doesn't say in 2 weeks, not Yotza. So you have to count weeks. So you are counting weeks as well. So you have a mitzvah to count weeks, and therefore the day that has the kedusha, which you could bring the carbon, is not really 1 day. It's really an entire week. Okay. Now the Gemara asks, the Mishnah, where we will now go back to the Mishnah which listed the 5 opinions. We had a Mishnah and a Brisa. We'll go back to the Brisa, that listed the 5 opinions as to when you violate the Isser Bal Ta'achar, and it had a long list of things that are included in this Isser Bal Ta'achar. One of them was Pesach, which means a carbon Pesach. So Gemara says, what do you mean? There's an Isser Bal Ta'achar not to delay bringing the carbon Pesach, which we said in the Mishnah could be up to 5 regalim later, up to almost a year later. How could you have time? The Carbon Pesach has to be brought on Erev Pesach, and if you miss it, you have Pesach Sheni, that's it. There is no other time. There's no extended. You don't have the deadline to bring it. What's the Gemara referring to? What are we saying? Gemara has 2 approaches here. The Gemara's first one is Rav Chisda, says Kedinas, but it was just mentioned. It was just thrown in there together with everything else because it's a long list of things you have to bring. But it's not really, this halacha doesn't really apply to that. There's no Bal Ta'acher on Carbon Pesach. Carbon Pesach is brought in its right time. It's not like you have a deadline like the other ones. The Gemara says, no, there is a way to explain it, and that's Rav Shesh's approach. He says that a carbon Pesach that's not brought on Pesach, meaning the animal that's set aside to be a carbon Pesach, which does not end up getting brought as a carbon Pesach because you lost it, that animal turns into a carbon Shlamim. That carbon Shlamim has these halachos. You got to bring it within the time of Bal Ta'achar, and that's what we're referring to. So Gemara says, well, then I don't need you to tell me the carbon Pesach because you told me Shlamim. It becomes a Shlamim. The Mishnah lists Shlamim. The Brisa lists Shlamim as having Bal Ta'achar. This is no different than any other Shlamim. Gemara says, no, it is different, because you may think since it comes from a carbon Pesach, it should have the halachos of carbon Pesach, and it should not have the halachos of Bal Ta'achar like a Shlamim. Therefore, the halacha that we see from here, the Mishnah spells out Pesach to teach me that it does have the halacha like a regular Shlamim. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know, how do you know that the halacha of Bal Ta'achar applies to all these things? We had a lot of different things in the list of the Brisa. How do we know that there's an Isser Bal Ta'achar on all of them? The pasuk of Bal Ta'achar only talks about a neder. Right? We had on our list, we had money, erchin, charamim, hektish, chatas, asham, oila, shlamim, tzedakah, meiser, bechar, meiser, behema, pesach, leket, chikha, and peah. All these things have to be brought once you set them aside, or once you promise to bring them, you have to bring them within the time of Bal Ta'achar. How do you know that such an Isser applies to all of them? The pasuk doesn't say that. So the Gemara is going to read the entire pasuk and learn something from each word. So the Gemara says as follows. The Torah says, Kisidor neder. When you promise to bring a neder. A neder means when you promise, I am going to bring a carbon, you do not designate a specific animal. So then there's a Bal Ta'achar on that. We know. What about if you make an adava? That means you say this animal is a carbon. You don't say you owe a carbon. This animal is a carbon. If the animal gets destroyed, you don't have to bring anything. So you say this animal is a carbon. How do you know that there's an Isser Bal Ta'achar as to how long you have until you violate delaying too long to actually bring it to the Beis HaMikdash? So there's a different pasuk in Vayikra that says neder oy nedava. It puts neder and nedava together. We see that both of them apply. Just like over there it says neder and it also means nedava, here it says neder, it also means nedava. Now the next phrase is Kisida neder la Hashem alekecha. What is la Hashem alekecha? That's to include all things that Kohanim have no portion of. It all goes to Shemayim, and that's where you give anything to Bedek HaBayis, anything to the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash. That would be if you give money, if you promise an erech, that's your value, Chayrim, Hektish, all these things are included in la Hashem alekecha, by the words la Hashem alekecha. Next it says, Lo Sa'achar L'Shalmai, you should not delay bringing it. The word L'Shalmai, ending with a vav, which means it is excluding something. Only this you shouldn't delay, not something else. What is that? The Gemara says that's to exclude where you have switched Kedusha. You have what's called Chilufav. When you switch the Kedusha of one carbon to another carbon, the Isser of Bal Ta'achar does not apply to the second carbon. The Gemara later in the Daf will explain what that means. Then it says, Ki Deroshi Dershenu, Hashem will demand it from you. That refers to all the things that are obligatory. That's a carbon Asham, carbon Ola, carbon Chatas, carbon Shlamim. There are some types of Ola and Shlamim that are obligatory. It's referring to those. That would be Ola Siriyah and Shalmei Simcha. All those that are obligatory are included in that. Now it says Hashem Lekecha again. Why do you have to say Hashem Lekecha again? It says Deroshi Dershenu Hashem Lekecha. We just mentioned Ki Sidor Neder Hashem Lekecha. Why do you have to repeat over here Hashem Lekecha? So Gemara says this is to have a drasha to include tzedakah, meiser, and bechor. Why? Because the phrase Hashem Lekecha appears in the parsha of tzedakah, meiser, and bechor. V'chol tiyat tzedakah l'fnei Hashem Lekecha, v'chad l'fnei Hashem Lekecha, meiser Tigancha, all these are, it says, L'Hashem Mekacha. Next, the Torah says, Me'imach, the Rosh Hashana Hashem Mekacha Me'imach, from you. Me'imach is to include Leket, Shulchan, and Peah. Over there it says, Es Ha'ani Imach, and therefore this references Leket, Shulchan, and Peah that they're also included in this halacha. Now the last phrase is V'haya B'chal Chet, because you will have, otherwise you'll have an Aveira. So it says, you will have an Aveira, but not your carbon. There's nothing wrong with your carbon. Chet means lack. There's no lack in your carbon. The carbon is not puzzle if you delay it. You violate it about the acher, but the carbon is no psol, you can still bring it. No problem. And now the Gemara is going to analyze all these things one phrase at a time. Well, most of them one phrase at a time. So the first one is you should not delay bringing it. This only applies to it, the animal itself, that you are makdish as a carbon. Does not apply to if its kedusha is switched to somewhere else. The Gemara says, what is the case? What is the case? What are we referring to here? And we're going to have a problem either way, because if it's a carbon that you could bring, if it's a switched kedusha and you could bring the carbon, it's a kosher carbon, so then it's included in everything else we said before. It's a carbon now. It's included in Baal Ta'achar automatically. I don't need a special pasuk to tell me that it's not included, because it is included. And if it's referring to something which you can't bring as a carbon, I still don't need the Torah to tell me that there's no Isser of Baal Ta'achar. I can't even bring it. Of course there's no Isser of Baal Ta'achar. So what are we referring to? So the Gemara spells out the options. The Gemara says, if we're talking about carbon ol and carbon shlamim, the kedusha could be switched. How could that be? If you lose your carbon, you had an animal set aside, you lose it, then you bring another one to replace it, you're makar of that one, then you find the first one. So the halacha is that animal has kedusha, has a carbon kedusha on it. It didn't lose its kedusha, but you no longer have an obligation, because you could still bring it as a carbon other than a carbon shlamim. It still has that force. So Gemara says, so then I don't need a pasuk. How could a pasuk say there's no Baal Ta'achar? There is Baal Ta'achar. Why shouldn't there be? So Gemara says, maybe you were referring to a chatas. The halacha is if you lose a chatas and you bring something else instead, it's called a chatas shekipru bayim. The halacha is that chatas has to be destroyed, it has to be left to die. So there, you can't bring it as a carbon. Certainly the Torah can't say Baal Ta'achar, don't delay to bring it. I'm not allowed to bring it. Gemara says, maybe it's referring to a carbon taida. The halacha of a carbon taida is that if you transfer kedusha of a carbon taida to something else because it got lost, the breads, the 40 loaves of bread that go together with a carbon taida are not brought. They're only brought with the original carbon taida, not with a later carbon taida that you transferred kedusha. Someone says what happened here is as follows. I had a carbon taida set aside. I had its kedusha transferred to another one because I lost it, and I found the first one. I have both of them now here, and I confused them, and I don't know which one's which. So I can't bring any of them because actually, the Gemara adds a phrase here. If I have them both, I could bring them both, and I could bring the breads, and I'll say the breads are to whichever one is the original. But if one of them dies now, and I don't know which one died, now I can't bring it, because I don't know if it's the one supposed to get the breads, because it's the original carbon, or if it's not supposed to get the breads, because it's the later carbon. So I don't know whether I should bring it with breads or without breads. Therefore, I have nothing to do with it. So I can't do anything. So on that one, the Torah says there's no Baal Ta'achar. You don't violate Baal Ta'achar for not bringing it. So the Gemara asks, obviously, of course you don't violate Baal Ta'achar. You can't bring it. What am I supposed to do? Why do I need the Torah to tell me that you don't violate Baal Ta'achar? So the Gemara says, I'll give you a different explanation. We're going back to a carbon oil or shlamim, where it is a valid carbon. And the Torah has to tell me that there's no Baal Ta'achar because of a specific case that happens. So let's say, according to the opinion, that you have 3 regalim, you have 3 yomim tovim until you violate it. So let's say 2 pass on the original carbon, and then you lose it, and you get another carbon instead. So now you start the clock over again, and you have another 3 regalim, or you have one more regel, and you count the 2 that were on the first carbon, and then you violate the Yisr. What's the halacha? So Gemara says, the Torah is telling me you start the clock over again. You don't count the original regalim that passed on the first animal, because that's only Baal Ta'achar on him. You need a new Baal Ta'achar on the next carbon. It's a whole new thing. The time that passed towards the Baal Ta'achar calculation in the original carbon does not transfer to the second animal that got the transferred kedusha. Says that's very good according to the opinion that you have 3 yomim tovim until you violate Baal Ta'achar. But according to Rabbi Meir, they should only have 1 yontif. So what's the case going to be? As soon as 1 yontif goes by, you already violated the Isser of Baal Ta'achar. Says the case will be if you switched kedusha in the middle of Yom Tov, half the Yom Tov went by. And the question will be the same thing. Do I count the first days as if they are also in the second animal, and therefore as soon as Yom Tov's over I violate the Yisr? Or do I say no, Yom Tov could be over, and this animal was only a carbon for half a Yom Tov, so I didn't violate Baal Ta'achar yet. I didn't have a Yom Tov that went by. And that's the halacha the Torah teaches me. l'shalmai, that this halacha only applies to it, but you get a new animal, kedusha transfers, you have to start the count over again. All right, now the Gemara wonders, when it says v'hay b'cha chet, if you violate the Isser of Baal Ta'achar, you didn't make a psul in the carbon. So the Gemara wonders, why do we need this pasuk? We have a source for that halacha from somewhere else, that you don't get a psul in a carbon just because you were violating Baal Ta'achar. Where's that? So it's a brisa quoting a Chayrim. A Chayrim says, you learn from where it says, so there you have Bechar and Meiser together. So there's a connection between Bechar and Meiser. So you learn from Meiser to Bechar, just like Meiser from your crops. You don't passel, there's no psul in the Meiser. If you don't bring it within a year, you're supposed to bring it within the first year. But if you don't, there's no psul. You have up to 3 years. So same thing applies to a carbon Meiser Behema. There's no psul if you don't bring it within the year that you're supposed to. If you delay too long, still fine. You have, there's no psul. It's still bringable afterwards. So now why do I need this pasuk then that we said here of hay b'chachet v'lay b'karbanechachet? Which says you need it because the fact that you have a source from Ma'aser Behema doesn't mean you have a source for other karbanos. Ma'aser Behema is different than other karbanos. That's because Ma'aser Behema is not mechaper, if anything. It's not meratze. It's not coming to appease anything. A firstborn animal becomes a carbon. It's Ma'aser Behema. That's a Bechar. A Ma'aser Behema, 1/10 of every animal is Ma'aser. That has to be given. How do you learn from there to a carbon Chatos or Ola, or even Shlavim, something like that, which has a purpose of being Mechaper or Meratza? That I may think, if you didn't do it on time to gain your Kapara, so you messed up the animal. It's useless now. Therefore, we need the Hay B'chachet to teach me that no, it's not messed up.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.